Reading from the Gospel this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. Jesus has been questioned by various and sundry officials, and he's answered all their questions, and yet they find one more. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the laws and the prophets." It has happened before. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he challenged the people to follow the God of Sarah and Rebekah and Rachel. He brought with him the tablets of stone which contained the laws which would be the guiding principles by which they would choose to live. They would be God's people, and God would be their God. No more a mass of humanity wandering in the wilderness. In that moment, the nation of Israel was born. It happened nearly 2,000 years later when an itinerant preacher was asked which law was the greatest. The legal scholars had already given up questioning him. It was up to the Pharisees to try and trap him. Which is the greatest commandment? They knew the expected answer, and they got the answer they expected. Love God with heart, soul, and mind. I imagine they might have been a little disappointed. They must have been hoping that Jesus would give some other answer so that they could say he was wrong. But Jesus gave them the traditional answer. But as he so often does, he doesn't stop there. He goes on and says there's more, a second commandment that is just as important as the first. Love your neighbor as yourself. And they might have accepted this addition if Jesus had stopped there. But again, he goes on. All the commandments, the 10 written in stone, the 613 recorded in the law books, all of them are summed up. All of them hang on these two: love God and love neighbor. Seismic shifts have continued. Augustine, Martin Luther, John Campbell, John Calvin, Alexander Campbell, Martin Luther King Jr., Pope John Paul the 23rd, shifts that have forever changed the way we practice our faith. For 1,500 years, Judaism had been a sacrificial religion with laws covering all of life, especially covering the way one worships. And Jesus' answer was a game changer. Head religion, keeping rules, was replaced by heart religion, practicing love. Of course there was pushback. There is always pushback. Out in the desert, there were those who wanted to have nothing to do with Moses' covenant, and that night 10,000 of them died in the battle that ensued. They would have rather returned to Egypt than be free from slavery. And there was pushback against Jesus too. Eventually, he would be put to death. Put to death so that the faith that they knew he was teaching, and the faith that they knew was not theirs, would never change. The laws stayed in place. The temple stayed in place. The sacrifices continued, but not for long. I don't know if we are living in a time of seismic shift or not. What I do know is that things are changing quickly, more quickly than I can ever remember. If we are not living during another seismic shift, I'll be surprised. But if we are, which I think we are, it is not a shift that denies Jesus' teaching on loving God and love neighbor. Rather, it is a call to justice, kindness, and humility. It is a justice to love both more deeply and to love more broadly. It is a call to speak for those who have no voice, a call to show mercy rather than call for judgment, a call to humility with the recognition that we are not God, nor are we superior to any of our neighbors. I sometimes feel like the only thing I do is preach on love, loving God and loving neighbors, and I imagine you must feel like that too, because sermon after sermon is on love. That's because Jesus talked about it so much, because he knew it sounded so simple, but it was so hard, is so hard. There must be more to being a Christian than just that, isn't there? There's got to be something more than love. Aren't we more comfortable with offering money than offering our lives? Maybe not calves or rams or oil, especially rivers, 10,000 rivers of oil. Certainly not our firstborn, a human sacrifice. We'd be willing to increase our giving, maybe even tithe, if we knew that it would be enough to guarantee God's acceptance. But Micah reminds us that God is not all that interested in how we worship. God is interested in how we love. This life that we live together sometimes seems like it's about just enough to get along, but it's not about just enough. And sometimes we think it's about trying to somehow gain God's acceptance. But it's not that either, because God has already accepted us. It's about the gift of love, receiving and giving love. And frankly, the church has mostly been about judgment. The historic church. We've been slow to love. We have thought that we could choose who to love, choose our neighbor, choose who not to love. We defined neighbor tight enough so that we could love them and we didn't have to worry all those who weren't inside our love box. We live at a time when the definition of Samaritan or neighbor is expanding more rapidly than we seem to be able to adapt. More and more we are challenged to open our hearts. We are challenged to open our souls. We are challenged to walk humbly with God. But we are reluctant. Loving is a dangerous thing. Loving is a dangerous thing. If we loved God with our whole heart, we might be changed in ways that we can't even imagine if we opened ourselves fully up to the love of God. And risking to love another person is to open oneself up to the greatest joy or the greatest hurt that one can experience. So perhaps our reluctance is created by a climate where some in our lives, some in our culture, our society, never think about loving God, but seem to do a better job at loving neighbor than we do. We have friends like that, don't we? We have family members like that, perhaps. We all have acquaintances whose life is more reflective of God's love and loving neighbor than ours, and they don't darken the door of a church. We've been far from accepting, and we've held judging close at hand. We have derided difference rather than to affirm diversity. We have been unwilling to practice justice. We've rejected mercy, demanding instead retribution. We have walked day and night on the path of hubris rather than the path of humility. We're pretty comfortable at this place saying all are welcome when we know that some would never think about coming through our doors. If we are experiencing a seismic shift, it is that we, the church, are in part being led to loving God and neighbor more profoundly by outside pressure than by internal transformation. One of the ways that happens has been the way of political correctness. Yes, political correctness. But tell me, why is it wrong to treat women with respect? Why is it wrong to use language that affirms rather than derides? Why is it wrong to turn some away because they don't fit our definition of neighbor? Aren't we all God's children? Aren't we all created in the image of God? Hardly a day goes by when I don't hear someone say they are tired of the political correctness BS. But it's not BS. It's GS or JS. It's God stuff or Jesus stuff. It's just and kind and importantly humble. And that's God's call on our life. Not to be politically correct, but the call is to be Christ-like correct. And that call is to love God and love our neighbor. And God defines our neighbor, not us. The truth is that there was a seismic shift 2,000 years ago, and we're still trying to wrap our hearts and minds and souls around it. It's pretty easy to say we love God and our neighbor, but we find it nearly impossible to do. I think Jesus was saying that loving God and loving neighbor are exactly the same thing. That when we are loving our neighbor, we are loving God. And when we are loving God, we are loving our neighbor. Micah says that the love of God is justice and mercy and humility. But what is justice? For the millions of women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted. How do we show mercy to children who are in our country who didn't come on their own, but were forced by parents or others to come illegally? How do we live humbly when we are so often told and reminded that we are the only super world power? Actually, we need a seismic shift. A shift from thinking we're right and everyone else is wrong. We need to shift from believing that there is only one way to worship God. We need to shift from pushing some aside and ignoring others. We need to shift from pointing fingers and passing judgment. We need to shift from believing that God will ultimately take care of things, thus letting ourselves off the hook. We need to shift from sitting on our hands, being passed over, passed up, by others making no claim to be following Christ, but practicing love of their neighbor better than we do. I wonder, can we be a church that loves God and neighbor in such a magnificent way that others want to be part of our family? Can we live love out in a manner that attracts those who already love their neighbor but have not learned to love God? Can we be a church that doesn't just say, y'all come, but a church that truly welcomes everyone? If we can, if we do, there will be pushback. He said, "On these two hang all the law and the prophets." And they hanged him on a tree. Amen.